Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the keynote today. Our keynote speaker, I will introduce her very briefly because I'm sure you already know who she is. She has amazing reputation. Dr. Alice Kessler-Harris is a professor of American history at Columbia University. She's also a professor in the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. And she specializes in the history of American labor and the comparative and interdisciplinary exploration of women and gender. She has authored or edited about 20 books, some of which include In Pursuit of Equity, Women, Men, and the Quest for Economic Citizenship in 20th Century America, Out to Work, A History of Wage Earning Women in the United States, A Woman's Wage, Historical Meaning and Social Consequences. I will just mention her most recent book is A Difficult Woman, The Challenging Life and Times of Lillian Hellman. And I just want to add that according to one of her students here, she's also an amazing woman, an amazing advisor, and I think she's also a great speaker. She's a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. And she is, this lecture is part of a series for the OIH. So thank you, Alice, for being here.
Thank you, Miglena. Thank you, everybody, for coming. So let me start by talking about the OAH. Do you know what the OAH is? No. Well, I'm here courtesy of the Organization of American Historians, which is the largest professional organization of American historians in the United States, that is, of historians who study the United States. And one of the things that they do, among their many activities, they publish the Journal of American History, which anybody here who's ever studied American history will surely have read at least one article in. And in addition to that, they have a program of what they call distinguished lecturers, which means that they send people like me around the country talking about whatever we feel like talking about. And you guys do pay a fee or something to the OAH for doing it. So I'm here on behalf of the OAH. And if anybody wants to join the OAH, I even have some membership brochures. You should feel free to send in your dues, which are very cheap for students, but not so cheap for anybody else. And they will be very glad to send you an issue or 4 issues of the Journal of American History, and you might even enjoy it. It might be fun. So, okay, that's the OAH pitch. And now I'm going to put on my hat as well, let me put on my hat as a historian of wage-earning women or working-class women. I've been in this game now for a lot of years, more years than, as I look around the room, most of you have been alive. I hate to say that, but there it is. And I've discovered in the last 30, 40 years of being in this game, that the perspectives through which historians look at history change dramatically, not just from generation to generation, but sometimes from year to year, or from graduate student generation to graduate student generation, that is every 6 or 7 years. And so one of the things I want to say is my favorite illustration of how perspectives change comes from a story that was told me by a kindergarten teacher who said she walked into class one day. She wanted to teach the class about the evils of alcohol. And so she brought into class a little wiggly worm, a tumbler of water, and a tumbler of pure alcohol. And she popped the worm into the tumbler of water, and the worm swam around very happily, and the 6-year-olds sitting around her giggled. And then she took the worm out of the glass, and she popped it into the glass of alcohol, and the worm shriveled and crumbled and disappeared. And she looked at the class, which was looking at her horrified, and a little boy standing in the back looked at her, and she said, "So what does this mean, Danny?" And he looked at her and he said, "Well, means if you drink alcohol, you don't get no worms." Now, that wasn't quite the lesson that she wanted to teach, but it's a lesson that works, nevertheless, for what I want to say to you today. I want to talk to you, or at least I want to start talking to you, about an incident that occurred a couple of months ago. I went to a conference in New York City organized by The Baffler, which some of you may know. It's an online magazine which takes controversial positions about many different issues. And the conference was called Feminism for What? Equality in the Workplace After Lean In. And now you all know about Lean In, yes? Nod your heads, yes? Is that a no back there? You all know about Lean In, right? Sheryl Sandberg, who's the chief executive officer of Facebook, wrote a book in which she urged women like you, like me, to lean in, to take charge, to put themselves forward and take leadership positions. What I heard at the conference was a debate between and among feminists. We were all feminists. I have to identify myself as a feminist to give this talk, so I hope everybody will recognize that the we that I use is, well, you'll hear, it's not a generic feminist we, but it is a feminist we. What I heard was a debate between and among feminists who supported individual strategies for women to get ahead, on the one side, and on the other side, feminists who argued that those strategies were counterproductive, that supporting those strategies was negative. They would, argued the naysayers, encourage some women to get ahead, and that would be fine, but the cost of getting ahead would be of focusing on collective strategies that will ameliorate some of the larger problems faced by all women, or many women, in our societies. So some of those big problems, and those of you who were in the room for the session right before this actually might have heard some of them popping up in the discussion. But those big issues include things like poverty, unemployment, family disintegration or dysfunction, the rising levels of inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor, and to my mind, what's probably the biggest problem of them all, the loss of dignity that comes with the limits on democratic voice that happen when people can't live in poverty on unemployment insurance, and so on. These problems, argued one large group in that meeting, required collective solutions, solutions that came from the bottom up, and solutions that were encompassing and not derived from the interests of individual women. These collective solutions, you can imagine, argues Sheryl Sandberg in her book, Lean In, and she does actually indirectly address them, are pipe dreams. They're never going to happen, she says. She's in favor of encouraging women to make the best of themselves, to go for top positions. And she argues, only when women have power will they be able to change the conditions of the world in which they live in. We women, she argues, should have three concerns. How can we climb to the top? How do we balance family and work? And how do we reduce the stress level involved in getting to the top, to leadership positions? Now that's a very different perception of feminism, and you could certainly call it feminism, than the one that many in my generation started with. So I might as well confess that I am actually of that generation. I finished graduate school in 1968, and by 1969 I was deeply involved in, well, I'm not going to tell you which elements of the women's movement. I'll let you ask that question later if you want to. But I was deeply involved in the women's movement, and so I'm part of that generation which actually saw and participated in the second wave's efforts to transform the society. Many of my generation started out by thinking not of those individual solutions, but of thinking more collectively. Among the panelists at Feminists for What, this conference that day, many, however, would have disagreed with me, with each other, with Sheryl Sandberg. There was one, Linda Hirschman, a lawyer and a journalist who's written a book whose name I can't remember now. But she asked what was really the crucial question of all of us. She said, well, you know, who could object to leaning in? Who could object to women pushing themselves up to the top? But then she paused and she said, what's the harm in leaning in? What harm does it impose? And she had answers to that question. She argued that leaning in supported the social stratification of women, that is, it encouraged those women who wanted to get ahead to lean on and rely on poorer women, less privileged women, who they needed to hold down in order to achieve the top positions that they wanted. That leaning in other words, would encourage people to adopt strategies that not only supported themselves, but that supported the economic and social causes that themselves were responsible for undermining the collective well-being of all women or of most women. That leaning in the idea of leaning in derived from the notion that capitalism and the marketplace could and should benefit from competition among individuals instead of from cooperation among individuals. Ah, well, good. Now that it's gone, I'm no longer the victim of technology. Well, yes, there is, of course, some truth in that. There's also some truth in arguing that leaning in is therefore incompatible with feminism. That is, that the pushing forward of an individual undermines collective well-being, exactly the opposite of what our generation, or many in our generation, hoped for. You might be sitting here skeptically saying, hey, wait a minute, is she attacking capitalism? The answer is yes. In this respect, I am. I am not attacking all of capitalism, but I am attacking what you might call the excesses of free market capitalism. A free market capitalism which argues that the only thing that matters is an individual's relationship to the marketplace, that the marketplace will govern what is fair and what is just. That debate reflects a huge division among women, and it's a debate which we had in the 1970s and which continues. Perhaps my side has lost it today, but to some extent it at least continues today. It goes to the roots, I want to argue, of our sense of ourselves as a nation, and perhaps even further than that. Are we, I want to ask, individuals, each pursuing our own interests, and in the manner of Jeremy Bentham, hoping then that in the end, the pursuit of self-interest will enhance the good, the collective good, the good of all of us as a nation? Philosophers tell us that, or philosophers call that negative liberty. So, and here I'm quoting Isaiah Berlin, who makes the argument that individuals who are allowed to pursue their own good require simply to be left alone. They want liberty, but they want negative liberty. They want no intervention in what they can do. That reasoning, you will recognize, of course, underlines and sustains the current widespread support for free market capitalism. Just keep your government hands off my Medicare is one of its favorite slogans, for example. Just keep your hands off and the market will take care of everything. Everything will take care of itself. But second wave feminism had another root as well. That root was vested in a much more shared notion, you might call it a collective notion, of what of the nation as a whole. And here again, Isaiah Berlin calls this positive liberty. What's positive liberty? Well, positive liberty is an active effort to make sure that everybody has sufficient economic resources, sufficient economic security to participate effectively in public life. We feminists believed in something that we called sisterhood, the idea of solidarity, that we were in some sense each other's keepers, that our struggle was to be inclusionary, not exclusionary. We could put this another way, and here's an issue that I've been working on for a while. In the 20th century, social theorist T.H. Marshall, some of you might know, he was a British social theorist who's become very influential in welfare state theory. Marshall argued that the extension of what he called social rights would be necessary in order to preserve the civil and political rights that we had all won in the 19th and early part of the 20th century. That is, that we had won and had benefited from an extension of democracy to almost everybody, a freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the civil rights that we all take for granted. But he argued, to keep those rights, we would need as a country to extend what he called social rights, because there was no way you could maintain democracy unless everybody shared in a modicum of equality. You had to be prepared as a society to provide everybody with enough food to eat, with housing and shelter, with jobs as they were needed, with a good education, or at least a reasonable education. In short, with those things which would enable individuals to function as political and civil citizens. It was no good to have freedom. It was no good to offer democratic freedoms unless you offered the education and the economic security that would allow people to participate in their government and their polity. Those two sides of the debate continue today. It reflects, and did reflect, a huge division among women that goes to the roots of our sense of ourselves. I mean, I could give you illustrations of how this specifically affects women. I could invoke abolitionist women, for example, who identified sisterhood, in that case, their sisterhood, as mothers with the mothers who were enslaved, and their argument that all slaves should be freed because no mother should be enslaved. I could talk to you about the progressive period and invoke women who I'm sure you know, like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald, and the founders of the social settlements, who believed that only if you reformed municipal politics as a whole could you ever provide the children of immigrant women with reasonable kindergartens, for example. Only if you educated immigrant women could you encourage them to consume in healthy ways and raise healthy families. In other words, generations of women have been involved in maintaining what Berlin calls positive liberty. In order to exercise complete liberty, you needed to provide the basis for that liberty. But I think what I want to do is spare you that background and just hop quickly into the New Deal, which is where this conversation begins, and then move on from there. The women's movement, in all of its historic incarnations, has always held the social purposes of womanhood, the social purposes of society in its highest esteem. So along comes the New Deal, and here we have a precedent, a moment, a crisis, when suddenly it isn't just the women's movement that is saying, hey, wait a minute, our democracy is crumbling in the face of a 25% unemployment rate and starvation in the street and breadlines and a rising communist party and on and on and on, radicalism that's going to split the country in half. And suddenly, I know I'm oversimplifying too much here, but along comes Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he and a united country, pretty much united behind him, say, the government has to step in and provide the foundation stones for a continuing democracy. It can do that by restraining capitalism, that is, by saying to capitalists, to corporations, for the moment at least, your profits are somewhat less important than providing wider employment for the population, so let's tax you a little more and provide WPA employment programs and so on. And it is in the New Deal period, as you know, that the government steps in and says we need old age pensions, we need aid to families of dependent children, we need unemployment insurance, and the federal government steps in to put itself in a position of providing positive liberty. What you may not know is that many of the particular programs that the government actually designed and provided were designed by women who had come out of the progressive period collective mentality. Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor, among them. Eleanor Roosevelt herself, though she wasn't a designer, among them, had been part of the she'd been part of the Women's Trade Union League. You know, I could name a dozen more: Mary Dewson, Grace Abbott, Edith Abbott, and so on. Edith Abbott was a designer of the Social Security Act. Grace Abbott was the head of the Children's Bureau, who designed the AFDC program. All these women came out of a tradition of collective responsibility, for lack of a better name. They were committed, and we as a country came out of the New Deal committed to maintaining a standard of living that we called the American standard of living. And that American standard of living was something that Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, as he took office in 1952, committed himself to participating in. In other words, in the 1950s and the early part of the 1960s, there was a general commitment to this second form of identifying America as all of us, each other's brothers and sisters, and doing within limited means what we could to help each other. My favorite example, of course, is Lyndon Baines Johnson, who might not be your favorite example, but I note that the war on poverty, which, in addition to his war on Vietnam, which we don't like so much, or some of us don't like so much, but his war on poverty was designed to do exactly that. As he put it, he said, you need an even space at the starting gate to have an even competition. And it was the government's role to create that even space at the starting gate. So Head Start programs, job training programs for the poor, more effective welfare benefits, more generous welfare benefits, and I could go on, but I won't. And yet, despite this commitment, this widespread commitment, the overwhelming tension remained and remains in American society. A tension that many women felt as the women's movement was beginning. After all, here was a movement which it may well have been thought of in the early part of the 1960s to place women in the same place at the starting gate. You know, the EEOC, which started work in 1965, took on gender as well as race as one of its policies. But here was a movement in which women, for the first real time in American history, had the opportunity to move forward. And that strain in the American being, we call it liberal feminism now, that strain pushed women, and we heard some of that ongoing in the advance report from North Dakota State University just before this talk. And that strain pushed women into graduate schools, into medical schools, into professional schools, in huge and rising numbers. So I can tell you that in 1968, when I finished graduate school, 2.5% of the nation's physicians were female. 2.5%. 3.5% of the nation's lawyers were female. Because for the most part, law schools and architecture schools and medical schools and dental schools were closed to women. So logically, as those barriers began to fall, as women in the late 1960s began to say, you know, we want that place at the starting gate, and they pushed themselves over the hurdles, forcing open the gates of the prestigious educational institutions, of the professional schools, and situated themselves in ways that could move them upwards. A large proportion of women began actually to benefit from the women's movement and to benefit from exactly that free market competition that they were in a position to take advantage of. As women increasingly became educated, as their numbers in colleges increased so that they became, now they're more than 50% of college enrollees throughout the United States. Then they started out at about 37%, 39%, and they were channeled in very narrow directions. As this began to happen, many of us, many women, I'm one of the people who benefited from this, couldn't help but take advantage of liberal feminism. We moved forward. We moved to the top. You know, I got a chair at Columbia University. Could that have happened a generation before me? No, there wasn't a single female chair holder at, well, there were 3 in the entire university when, in 1970. But they were few and very far between. We, by the late 1970s, were touting our success. Look at what we had done as women, we were saying. We now had, a family and medical leave act not yet on the books. That wasn't going to happen until 1992, believe it or not, 1993, believe it or not. But we had on the books affirmative action legislation which forbade people from discriminating against us in the wage labor force. We had Title IX on the books, which mandated that any university that took advantage of federal funds had to provide equal opportunity for women in sports and their own activities. And we had on the books, at least in principle, legislation that denied trade unions, an important segment still then of the population, from discriminating against women. By the late 1970s, we thought we had won. We were on the way to winning if we hadn't quite won. We were wrong. We were just plain wrong. Because by the 1990s, it was clear that whatever our victories were, they were limited. They were limited to a small group of women, people like me, people like you, who'd been educated well enough so that they could take advantage of the open opportunities. They were still limited by discrimination, particularly against parents who were female, not against parents who were male. Fathers benefited. Fathers got a boost from being male. But women, we discovered, suffered what we came to call by 2000 a maternal penalty. If you were a woman and you had children, the chances statistically were that your wages would be somewhere between 7 and 10% below the wages of a comparable woman with no children, to say nothing of a comparable man. We discovered that the wage gap, which had narrowed significantly from, well, we don't have it, but I used to wear a badge, which I took a photograph for you, which said 59 cents. So in 1968, women earned 59 cents for every dollar earned by a man. By 1980, she was earning 73 cents, and by 1990, she was earning 77 cents for every dollar earned by a man. That figure climbed a little higher to 79 cents and then started to fall. And we're back down to 77 cents to the male dollar. We discovered that occupational segregation had diminished. Now, occupational segregation, that is the channeling of men and women into different kinds of jobs, is the major reason that women earn less than men earn. In 1968, something like 90% of women worked in jobs where which were at least 70% female held. So most women worked in female jobs. That figure began to decline. Women were actually getting jobs in the academic community, and they were getting jobs in hospitals even as doctors. And they were getting jobs in law firms, and they were getting jobs in the financial industry. And then there was the glass ceiling. Again, we heard a little bit about that. We discovered that women would be hired into the academic world as assistant professors in approximately equal numbers, and then slowly their numbers would diminish as discrimination, children, family obligations, and other things took their toll. By the year 2000, we, the country, had reversed its mantra. Instead of recognizing that women had, in some sense, won and opening the doors to women, the argument now was send women back home to the workforce. What's happening to the children? You know, how can children be raised without women at home? Ah, said the liberal feminists, but you can keep the men at home. No, said the community in general, you can't keep the men at home. They still earn, even though we need 2 incomes to support a family, men still earn most of the income. Well, by 2010, men no longer, well, they still earn most of the income, but it turns out that in almost a third, almost 30% of 2-income families, women are earning more than men are earning in the same families. 30% isn't much, but then you say, well, why can't that 30% stay home and take care of their children? They can't. Those men, like those women, are necessary income earners in the family. Well, says Sheryl Sandberg, there's a solution to this. Women can get ahead by leaning in. And this is the point at which I want to ask you to think about what that means. The historical lesson that I've just gone through suggests that making a few women better off, opening the doors so that some women who are individually motivated can take advantage of those open doors is a very good thing. I'm not opposed to it at all. But it is not enough. It is not enough by a long shot. And the reason it's not enough is because the larger solutions to the problems of family, we now call them family-work balance, but the larger solutions to who's going to take care of the children, the larger solutions to how women are going to become full democratic citizens of this country lie in shared or collective responsibility. To make that happen, we have to begin to work, for example, at eliminating poverty. We now have about 50 million, we say 50 million individuals in poverty, but about 2/3 of those are children, and about 8/10 of them are female. How on earth do we make sure that those women get to the starting gate unless we start to think about training programs, adequate support systems for all women, not just for a few women, but for all women? We now have a situation where the rich and the well-off, and I have to say, I was a guest at a dinner in Sheryl Sandberg's home about 2 years ago, and the beautiful, elaborate home that you can imagine, and a rather large dinner, and at some point while we were all having drinks, the nanny brought down her 2 children to greet the guests, and they very politely shook all our hands, and then the nanny whisked them off. And I said to myself, well, yes, you can lean in if you have a nanny. You can, we all had nannies. But how then do we think about caring for the children? Well, maybe we think about it in the way that some of the European countries have thought about it. The French have a crèche system. Every child over the age of 9 months is entitled to a place in a crèche. They pay a little bit if they can afford to pay a little bit, but for the most part, they're state-supported. Every child, not just the child of the poor, not just the child of the working mother, every child is entitled to a place in a crèche. Such a universal program puts at least, I don't know if it puts all women on the same footing, but at least creates a footing which promises some level of equality. We still live in a country where maternity leave, that is the childbearing leave, is mostly unpaid. Well, that's great if you live in a world where male providers take care of families, but male providers don't take care of families anymore. The number of single-parent, intact families where there's a single male breadwinner is down to about 6%. So it hardly exists anymore. So we need job-related benefits that are not targeted to a few individual women, but that are targeted universally. In other words, universal benefits. And here I think of another leaner inner, I'm forgetting her name, Maya, the president of Yahoo, who famously built a nursery. She got to be chief executive of Yahoo.com, and she had just had a baby, so when she was ready to come back to work, she turned the office next to hers into a nursery and installed a nursemaid and a crib and all the other things into the office so she could walk next door and nurse her baby. And everybody said, oh, isn't that wonderful? That's how women can do it. And in the very next breath, I mean, literally within a week after that became public, She, as chief executive, made the decision to prohibit Yahoo's employees from working from their homes, which they had been able to do for a certain number of hours per week. They had to come into the office. She could bring her baby into the office, but they had to leave their babies at home. Now, I have to say that there's a fundamental question of democracy here, when some women can deal with their work situations in some very privileged ways, and other women have literally no way to deal with their childcare situations. This is especially true for poor women. It's less true for middle-class women, but it's especially true for poor women. I could go on and I could give you more examples, but let me just do a couple of sort of illustrations of what I think would be good. And this comes actually from the 1970s. In 1973, a group called Union Wage, originating in California, decided that it, with this mandate for collective responsibility behind it, was going to put forth a platform around which it would organize union women and try to persuade unions to take the lead. What was its platform? It wanted things like the following. A minimum wage of, well, they asked for $4 an hour. $4 an hour then is equal to about $20 an hour now. I'd say, yeah, let's have a minimum wage of $20 an hour. They asked for a guaranteed annual income. The guaranteed annual income was actually part of Richard Nixon's platform and went through Congress in 1972 and then was vetoed by Richard Nixon for complicated reasons. They asked for a family assistance program, also one of Richard Nixon's programs, which he then stepped back on because he decided poor people really didn't deserve help with benefits for their children because it wouldn't be fair to middle-class people if we gave them to them. They asked for Social Security benefits with an inflation escalator. Now that we actually did to help elderly people, and it particularly helped elderly women who were then among the poor women who tended to be getting half of their husband's Social Security. They asked for paid maternity leaves, federally legislated, so that every employer would have to provide a paid maternity leave. And they asked for parental leaves as distinguished, which would benefit fathers as well as new mothers. I could go on, but you can see the gist of what they were doing. They were asking for universal benefits to all people because they said, we have a shared responsibility to our children. We have a shared responsibility to promote a democratic society. And in depriving women, poor women, undereducated women, women channeled into poor jobs of this kind of security, we put them at a permanent disadvantage. Academically, again, I refer back to the program that we just heard. Academically, we can do the following. We can stop the tenure clock for individual women. North Dakota has now done that very successfully, or given women a year's extension when they have children on the tenure clock. I think that's wonderful if you're lucky enough to be an academic who's up for tenure somewhere. But those jobs are few and far between now. So instead of working on the tenure clock, why don't we rethink the process as it discriminates and hurts both men and women who have families. Why don't we rethink the whole concept of family and think about benefits for those who are in caring roles, in addition to, maybe even instead of, those who are bearing the children? Our same-sex families, our families that are caring for elderly people or disabled siblings, those people also deserve the same kind of benefits. So I'm going to stop and say the following. What's wrong with leaning in? What's wrong with leaning in is it commits us to a particular competitive imagination. It encourages us to believe that if we get ahead, if we individually get ahead, if we push our children to get ahead, if we push women to get ahead, we will have made a better world. We won't have made a better world. We will have made it better for ourselves, and that's good. I'm not arguing against it. But I guess I want to say, how much better would it be if, in addition to leaning in, we also decided that we would participate in whatever larger program, maybe environmental feminism, tree hugging in India, raising the minimum wage, creating better conditions for raising poor children, figuring out how to do that. In other words, if we return to the collective mentality, the shared mentality of the kind of feminism that at least was on the books in the 1970s, I don't see it around us so much anymore. And yet I want to be a little bit optimistic in concluding. I want to hope, as Sheryl Sandberg says, that if we give power to women, women will actually engage in these activities. And although I can think of a dozen examples, Margaret Thatcher, the Queen Bee syndrome, and so on, of women, Maya, whose last name I've forgotten, the executive of Yahoo, of women who have achieved power and yet have not used that power to spread the wealth, if you like, to benefit women in general, to think about the situation of men and women, to create a more humane world. I can also think of women who have done that. And it's in thinking of those women that I think maybe, just maybe, this notion of collective responsibility or shared responsibility still exists somewhere at the bottom of our consciences, and that as women, as feminists who are both men and women, we might actually try to use that little bit that remains to create the more humane world that we want. Thanks.